All right. So today we're going to look at the characteristics of World War One. Look at three things: trench warfare on the Western Front, total war, and women gain freedom. So you're going to need a pen and paper for this, so make sure you have one. Press video if necessary. Got a pen and paper? Fabulous. Now, last time we did note-taking about timelines. This time we're looking at themes, not events. So we're going to have a different way of taking notes, which will be mind maps. We've done these last time. What I would like everyone to do is take your pen, take your paper, and I would like you to write these little circles here. Make sure that they're on the paper. Pause the video if necessary. Done it? Fabulous. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you this, you're going to watch this movie, and I'd like you to add keywords, important information, definitions, notes to the mind map as I talk along. So, for example, we're going to talk about trench warfare on the Western Front, and we're going to talk about the new weapons they use. I want to add here a note about poison gas. It was one of the new weapons, and it wasn't very effective because of wind and gas marks. So these are sort of notes and extra information that you can add. At the end of the movie, I'll give you a full list of keywords so that you can make sure that you have all of the ones that you need. When you're done, take a picture and you can use this to revise for the test. Right, quick recap of 1914. Right, so a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, kills an Austrian dude. This was the light which made Europe go boom, and very soon Austrians attacked Serbians, so Russians attacked Austrians, so Germany attacked Russians, and then declared war on Britain, France, and everybody is suddenly fighting each other. The Germans had their Schlieffen plan, the idea that Russians going to take a long time to get ready. France has got a lot of forts, so we're going to go through Belgium, destroy the French, go back and beat Russia. This doesn't work. Russia invades sooner than they expect. The Germans have to now fight on two fronts, on the east and the west. The British and the French are able to stop the Germans coming through Germany, but they are unable to push back from the Germans. And we're going to find out why the British and the French were unable to push back from the Germans and why the Germans weren't able to push the French and the British back today. Now, they're very different kinds of war. You've got the Western Front, got the Eastern Front, the Italian Front, the Balkan Front, the Turkish Front. All of these are very different wars, different ways of fighting, and we don't have enough time to do all of them. To give an idea, lots and lots of people basically are killed in every single one of these battles. But what we're going to focus on today is the Western Front here, around Belgium, around France. And it's a kind of warfare which was very static. People weren't moving. And this is the kind of trench warfare, the Loopgraaf oorlog. And then on the Eastern Front, there was some trench warfare, but there was much more movement. It's a very different type of war. So today we're looking at the Western Front. I'm going to answer this question. Why did the front not move very much? Well, lots of reasons for that. One, it was very difficult to attack a trench for different reasons. One, you had to go over the top of the trench and go through this area here called no man's land. Now, no man's land here was difficult to go through. One, because it was covered in barbed wire. You can see this here, which made it very difficult to progress. And secondly, it was very, very muddy, which means soldiers couldn't really go very quickly through there. Second reason, if you're going to attack an enemy trench, is, well, you are going to be walking into a lot of people firing a lot of bullets at you. Snipers, machine guns, rifles. Not only that, but there are huge guns behind the trenches which are going to be shelling you, and all sorts of horrible things can happen then. There are aircraft which can drop bombs on you and can see where you're going. It's all an absolute bloody nightmare. So, how do you break through? How do you attack a trench successfully? So people at the beginning of the war realized that because of the machine guns, because of snipers and the artillery, you're going to need something new. So first thing, poison gas, giftig gas, terrifying, causes horrible injuries. It burns people from the inside out. But It's too dependent on the direction of the wind. If the wind is blowing towards your own trenches, your own soldiers suddenly get covered in poison gas. In addition to that, people soon develop gas masks, not unfortunately for donkeys, but good enough for people. So the poison gas doesn't really make a huge difference. People invent tanks. Tanks can go over trenches and over barbed wire. But till 1917, there aren't many of them. And the generals, of course, the old men, they know how to fight with horses. They don't know how to fight with tanks, so they're not very effective. So other things, flamethrowers come into thing. Shrapnel shells, these are shells that are filled with little metal balls which explode everywhere and cause terrible damage. But again, not terribly useful, because if you go into your trench, and if we go back a few slides here, have a look here. You just go underground in one of these trenches behind, a deep dugout in the secondary trench here, and that basically can protect you from a lot of the artillery. So, all of these new weapons don't really help a huge amount, other than to get a lot of people very killed. Good example of this is the Battle of the Somme in 1916. The British tried to attack and break through German trenches. Now, before they started the attack, there were days of artillery, so shells and shells and shells, but the Germans basically just went underground, so it didn't really help. The British went over the trench, through the mud, through the barbed wire, and 55,000 people were either wounded or killed on just day one. Over 4 months of fighting, 315,000 soldiers are killed, and the front moves 10 kilometers. That's it. The Germans just move back, they dig new trenches, and the war carries on. Now, living in the trenches was horrible. First and worst thing was probably the mud, especially in wintertime. It was cold, it was wet, you could never get dry, you could never get clean. Then there was the shit. People obviously had latrines, they had WCs, but they may be back further in the second or the third trenches, and during an attack, well, you didn't have time to go to the toilet. So a lot of the time the men were living in shit, which means that there was the most appalling smell. Unwashed bodies, dead and decaying animals, often dead and decaying corpses of people. Rats were a constant trouble for soldiers, constantly crawling over them when they tried to sleep. There were lice, which infested every part of their clothing. These were Lauser, which meant that you were constantly itching and being bitten. And people had to live like this for 2 or 3 weeks at a time before they were allowed to go back to the secondary trenches, which means there was an awful lot of disease. Even worse than all of this was the fear. So, shell shock, or what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is now known about. Back in 1914 to 1918, people didn't understand that you could be psychologically damaged by warfare. People would live for months and months with a lot of boredom, but then suddenly have intense periods of fear with the artillery coming at you, with snipers shooting at you, with people running over the trench wanting to murder you with a knife. This kind of stress led a lot of people to break down. And actually, because the generals and the people in charge didn't understand what was happening to people, people could be shot for being cowards, lafards, simply because the stress of being in the trenches was just too much. Now, to get out of the trenches, even people in their home country had a lot to do. So people in Britain or parts of France which weren't fighting, or parts of America or Germany. Technology and industry were essential to carry on the fighting, and in order to produce enough equipment, uniforms, weapons, food, all of society had to be mobilized to produce this. Now, this is what we call total war. That meant when all available people who can fight are fighting, and if you weren't fighting, you were working for the war. It meant that people on the home front, this means in Britain or France or Germany, people who weren't fighting, all aspects of their lives were very tightly controlled by the government. How much food they could eat, how much they could buy in the shops. The government also asked people to lend them money from their own savings. This is geld dat ze hebben bespaard. Said, lend it to us so we can then buy more guns, so that we can then equip our soldiers. These were called war bonds in Britain, or liberty bonds in America. And the government used a lot of propaganda to show, for example, here in these pictures, Germans as being inhuman, or in the case of Germany's case, English or French troops as being terrible, inhuman people who had to be killed. So there's a lot of propaganda, and all aspects of people's lives are controlled by the government so that they can continue fighting. There was one tiny, tiny good thing which came out of the war, though, is with all the men fighting, women started to work more. They had to. They were working producing weapons and materials for the war. They were working in mines. They were doing jobs that previously only men had done. And because they became so much more important, it made it very difficult to stop women's demands for emancipation. This means equal rights and independence. And the most important right that women were able to gain because of this was the right to vote, stemrechten. This had been something we know from last term that women had been wanting for a long time. And the First World War was actually the time which allowed them to make these demands, and these demands being met. And in many countries, women actually were allowed to vote after the First World War. Now, hopefully now you have these keywords here, and you have them on your mind maps with a brief definition. If there are any of these words that you don't understand, if you don't know where they should be on the mind maps, ask your teacher, and I'm sure they will be very happy to help. Now we're going to do, if you've done your mind maps, you've taken the picture, you're happy with that, we're going to go a quick exercise here on historical empathy. This is understanding how people in the past thought and felt. I'd like you to go to LearnBeat 2.2, the First World War, go to projects and go to page 5. There, you're going to watch the first 15 minutes of World War I Apocalypse Part 3. Oh, it should not be fear, that's my typo, it should be hell. I want you to imagine you had to fight in World War I. Imagine that you were going to be in the trenches, you were going to be living in these trenches. Write down the top 3 worst things you would find about trench warfare and explain why these are the worst things. So it might be, for example, number 1, rats, number 2, the fear, number 3, mud, and explain why these things would be so terrible for you. Any questions, ask your teacher. Success.